Mount Rainier National Park, National Parks of the United States podcast. To understand the sheer magnitude of Mount Rainier, one must first grasp its presence in the landscape of the Pacific Northwest. It is not merely a mountain nestled among others. It is a solitary, towering colossus that dominates the horizon for hundreds of miles. Rising to 14,410 feet above sea level, it stands as the highest peak in the Cascade Range and the state of Washington. However, elevation figures alone fail to convey its mass. Mount Rainier is a topographic anomaly, a massive volcanic cone erupting from a base of rugged, non-volcanic mountains, soaring nearly 10,000 feet above the surrounding terrain in a single, unbroken sweep. This vertical relief makes it one of the most prominent peaks in the contiguous United States. Established on March 2, 1899, as the fifth national park in the country, Mount Rainier National Park preserves not just the mountain, but a complex, dynamic island of ecology, enclosed within boundaries that encompass nearly 250,000 acres. It is a place where fire meets ice, where the heat of the Earth's interior battles the crushing weight of the largest glacial system in the lower 48 states. The geographic setting of the park is defined by the Cascade Volcanic Arc, a segment of the Pacific Ring of Fire that extends from northern California to southern British Columbia. This arc exists due to the ongoing collision of tectonic plates off the western coast of North America. Deep beneath the ocean surface, the small but dense Juan de Fuca plate is sliding eastward and subducting beneath the lighter continental North American plate. As the oceanic plate descends into the mantle, heat and pressure drive water from the rock, lowering the melting point of the surrounding mantle wedge. This generates magma, which rises through the crust to feed the chain of volcanoes that includes Lassen, Shasta, Hood, St. Helens, and the king of them all, Rainier. While the current volcanic cone of Mount Rainier is relatively young in geological terms, dating back perhaps 500,000 years, the foundation upon which it sits is much older. The park's basement rocks consist of granodiorite and metamorphic remnants from the Tertiary period, created long before the modern volcano began to build itself. The mountain we see today is a stratovolcano, or composite volcano, constructed from layer upon layer of andesite and dacite lava flows, pumice, and volcanic ash. Unlike the fluid basaltic lava of the Hawaiian volcanoes, the magma here is viscous and silica-rich. When it erupts, it tends to pile up steeply near the vent, creating the classic conical shape. However, Mount Rainier is not a perfect cone. It is a battered, scarred monument to the violence of its own creation and the erosive power of its glaciers. The summit is truncated, a result of both explosive history and the grinding of ice. The distinctiveness of Mount Rainier National Park lies in its episodic and catastrophic geological history. This is not a dormant pile of rock. It is an active volcano that is slowly falling apart even as it builds itself up. One of the most significant geological features of the park is the evidence of massive lahars, or volcanic mudflows. Because the mountain is capped with over 25 cubic miles of snow and ice, any significant volcanic heat can melt this frozen reservoir instantly. The resulting mix of water, ash, and rock creates a slurry with the consistency of wet concrete that races down river valleys at highway speeds. The Osceola mudflow, which occurred approximately 5,600 years ago, was a cataclysmic event that removed the top 2,000 feet of the mountain's summit. This massive collapse sent a wall of mud flowing all the way to the Puget Sound, burying the landscape where the distinct cities of Kent, Auburn, and Sumner now sit. This event altered the shape of the mountain forever, leaving a vast summit caldera that was eventually filled by a younger lava cone, the Columbia Crest, which forms the modern summit. Surrounding this volatile geologic core is a hydrological system of immense power. Mount Rainier acts as a hydrometeorological catch basin. It stands directly in the path of the prevailing westerly winds blowing off the Pacific Ocean. As moisture-laden air masses strike the mountain, they are forced upward. As the air rises, it cools and condenses, dropping massive quantities of precipitation. At lower elevations, this falls as rain, fueling the temperate rainforests. At higher elevations, it falls as snow. Paradise, a famous subalpine area on the mountain's south slope, is one of the snowiest places on Earth where regular measurements are kept, historically recording annual snowfalls exceeding 90 feet. This immense precipitation feeds the park's defining feature, its glaciers. There are 25 major glaciers on Mount Rainier, radiating from the summit like the spokes of a wheel. These are not static sheets of ice, they are rivers of ice, constantly moving under the influence of gravity. The Carbon Glacier, located on the north side, has the lowest terminus of any glacier in the contiguous United States, descending into the forest zone. The Emmons Glacier covers the largest surface area, a vast white apron spreading across the eastern flank. The Nisqually Glacier, visible from the park's most popular road, has served as a primary laboratory for glaciology for over a century. These glaciers are powerful agents of erosion. They pluck rocks from the mountain's face and grind them against the bedrock, acting like coarse sandpaper. This grinding process produces glacial flour, a fine silt that suspends in the meltwater, turning the rivers emerging from the glaciers a milky turquoise color. This distinctive hue is a hallmark of the White, Carbon, Puyallup, and Nisqually rivers that drain the park. Below the zone of permanent ice and rock lies the ecological miracle of Mount Rainier, its vegetation zones. Because the mountain rises so dramatically from the lowlands to the stratosphere, it encapsulates a range of climates that would essentially require a drive from Canada to Mexico to experience laterally. This vertical zonation creates distinct bands of life, each adapted to specific temperature and moisture regimes. The lowest elevations, generally below 3,000 feet, are dominated by the lowland forest zone. This is the realm of the giants. Here, the temperate rainforest conditions allow biomass to accumulate on a scale rarely seen elsewhere. The dominant tree species are the Douglas fir, the western hemlock, and the western red cedar. These trees are not merely plants. They are pillars of an ancient architecture. Some Douglas firs in the park are up to 1,000 years old, their trunks massive columns rising 200 feet into the canopy. The forest floor here is a spongy, deep mat of detritus, mosses, and ferns. Light is a precious commodity, filtering through the needles and shafts. This environment is characterized by the presence of nurse logs, fallen giants that, as they decay, provide a nutrient-rich, elevated seedbed for new seedlings. It is common to see a row of young hemlocks growing in a straight line, their roots straddling the rotting carcass of a fallen ancestor. This cycle of death and rebirth is driven by fungi. The soil in these old-growth forests is threaded with a vast mycorrhizal network, a symbiotic association between fungal threads and tree roots. The fungi aid the trees in absorbing water and nutrients like phosphorus, while the trees provide the fungi with sugars produced through photosynthesis. As one ascends past 3,000 feet, the forest composition changes, entering the mid-mountain forest zone. The massive Douglas firs give way to the Pacific silver fir, the noble fir, and the Alaska yellow cedar. The understory changes as well. The dense sword ferns of the lowlands are replaced by huckleberry and rhododendron. The climate here is cooler, the snowpack lingers longer, and the growing season is shorter. This is a transitional zone, a buffer between the deep shade of the lowlands and the open exposure of the subalpine. Above 4,500 feet, the continuous forest begins to fragment. This is the subalpine zone, perhaps the most iconic ecological zone of Mount Rainier National Park. Here, the struggle for life becomes more visible. The trees, primarily subalpine fir and mountain hemlock, clump together in islands called tree clumps. This clustering creates a microclimate that offers mutual protection from the wind and creates a snow well that insulates the roots during winter. As the elevation increases, these trees become stunted and twisted, deformed by the weight of snow and the shearing force of wind. This form of vegetation is known by the German term Krummholz, or crooked wood. Between these islands of stunted trees lie the subalpine meadows, famous worldwide for their wildflower displays. These meadows are a study in urgency. For 9 months of the year, they are buried under 20 feet of snow. When the melt finally comes in July or August, the plants have a mere 6 to 8 weeks to sprout, flower, reproduce, and prepare for the next winter. The result is an explosion of color. The meadows at Paradise and Sunrise are carpeted with avalanche lilies, which are often the first to push through the thinning snow. They are followed by the magenta of paintbrush, the blue of lupine, the white of valerian, and the complex heads of western anemone. These plants have evolved specific adaptations to survive. Many are perennials with large root systems or bulbs that store energy underground, allowing for rapid growth the moment the snow clears. Others, like the western pasky flower, have fuzzy hairs on their stems and leaves to trap heat and break the wind, effectively wearing a fur coat. Above the subalpine meadows, starting around 6,500 feet, lies the alpine zone. This is a landscape of rock, ice, and snow, resembling the high Arctic. Conditions here are brutal. The soil is thin or non-existent, consisting mostly of talus and scree. The only vegetation that can survive here are lichens, mosses, and a few hardy alpine cushion plants that grow low to the ground to avoid the wind. This is the domain of the mountain itself, a place where biological life hangs by a thread, yet it is integral to the park's ecology. The fauna of Mount Rainier is as diverse as its flora, with species distributed according to these vertical zones. The wildlife here is not just present. It is actively engaged in a complex food web dictated by the extreme seasonality of the mountain. In the lowland forests, the black-tailed deer and the Roosevelt elk are the primary large herbivores. The elk, in particular, engage in vertical migration. During the summer, they move up to the subalpine meadows to graze on the nutritious forbs and grasses calving in the high country. As winter approaches and the snow depth increases, they descend back into the river valleys and lowlands where the canopy intercepts the snow, leaving the ground accessible for foraging. Following these herds are the predators. The park is home to elusive cougars, also known as mountain lions. These apex predators regulate the deer and elk populations, ensuring that the herbivores do not overgraze the vegetation. Black bears are also common, though they are omnivores rather than strict carnivores. In the late summer and fall, the bears of Rainier are often found in the huckleberry patches of the mid-mountain zone, gorging on berries to build up fat reserves for their winter hibernation. One of the most characteristic animals of the rocky subalpine and alpine zones is the hoary marmot. These large ground squirrels are the whistlers of the high country, named for the sharp alarm call they emit when predators approach. Marmots are true hibernators. They spend up to 8 months of the year asleep in deep burrows. their heart rate dropping to a few beats per minute to conserve energy. Their summer activity is a frantic race to consume enough calories to survive the long winter fast. Sharing the rocky talus slopes with the marmot is the American peacock. This small relative of the rabbit does not hibernate. Instead, it spends the summer haying, harvesting grasses and wildflowers, and drying them in the sun before storing them in rock crevices. The pika survives the winter under the snow, feeding on these stored hay piles. Pikas are considered indicator species for climate change. They are extremely sensitive to heat and cannot survive if temperatures rise too high, forcing them to move higher up the mountain until they run out of habitat. High on the cliffs and ridges, the mountain goat reigns supreme. These are not true goats, but goat antelopes, evolved specifically for steep, rocky terrain. Their hooves have a hard outer rim for digging into edges, and a soft, rubbery inner pad that provides traction on smooth rock. Their thick, double-layered white coats provide insulation against the severe alpine winds and camouflage against the snow. They browse on lichens, sedges, and alpine scrub, navigating terrain that would be lethal to almost any other large mammal. Bird life in the park is equally stratified. The dark, old-growth forests are the haunt of the northern spotted owl, a threatened species dependent on the structural complexity of ancient trees for nesting. The marbled merlin, a seabird, performs a miraculous commute, flying from the ocean to nest on the mossy limbs of giant conifers in the park's interior. In the subalpine zone, the Clark's nutcracker plays a vital role in the ecosystem. This bird has a symbiotic relationship with the whitebark pine. The pine relies on the bird to pry seeds from its cones and cache them in the ground. Seeds that are forgotten sprout into new trees, ensuring the propagation of the forest at the tree line. The white-tailed ptarmigan is the only bird that resides in the alpine zone year-round. It changes its plumage from mottled brown in summer to pure white in winter, gaining camouflage in a world of snow. To survive the cold, it grows feathers on its feet that act as snowshoes and burrows into the snowbanks to sleep. The aquatic ecosystems of Mount Rainier are less visible but critically important. The cold, oxygen-rich streams born from glacial melt are habitat for the bull trout, a species that requires the coldest, cleanest water to survive. These fish are glacial relics, their distribution shrinking as waters warm. In the high lakes and ponds, the Cascades frog thrives. This amphibian has adapted to the short season by having a developmental cycle that can accelerate depending on the temperature, ensuring tadpoles metamorphose before the ponds freeze over. The natural processes at work in Mount Rainier National Park extend beyond the biological and into the atmospheric. The mountain creates its own weather. The sheer physical barrier of the volcanic cone forces air masses to rise, cooling them rapidly. This is why the weather on the mountain can be violently different from the weather in the lowlands, just a few miles away. Sudden storms, whiteout conditions, and rapidly dropping temperatures are standard. This orographic lifting effect is also responsible for the rain shadow on the eastern side of the park. As the air masses dump their moisture on the western and southern slopes, they descend the eastern side as dry air. Consequently, the vegetation on the east side, near the Ohanepecoche and Sunrise areas, is noticeably drier and more open than the dripping rainforests of the Carbon and Hoh River valleys on the west. One cannot discuss the identity of Mount Rainier without acknowledging the human history and the naming of the peak, which remains a subject of dialogue. For thousands of years, the mountain was known to the indigenous peoples of the region, the Puyallup, Nisqually, Muckleshoot, Cowlitz, and Yakima, as Tahoma or Tacoma. The name translates roughly to the Mother of Waters or the Great White Mountain, reflecting its role as the source of the river systems that sustained life in the region. The mountain was a place of spiritual significance, a boundary marker, and a resource for hunting and gathering huckleberries. The name Rainier was applied in 1792 by Captain George Vancouver of the British Royal Navy. He named it after his friend, Rear Admiral Peter Rainier, a man who never saw the mountain, never visited the region, and whose primary historical significance was fighting against the American colonies in the Revolutionary War. Despite recurring movements to restore the name Tahoma, the official federal name remains Mount Rainier. The establishment of the park in 1899 was the result of a concerted effort by scientists, mountaineers, and conservationists. Unlike Yellowstone, which was preserved largely for its curiosities like geysers, Rainier was preserved for its scenic grandeur and its glacial systems. John Muir, the famous naturalist, visited the mountain and wrote passionately about its subalpine gardens. The group known as the Mountaineers and other local organizations lobbied specifically to protect the area from the mining and logging interests that were rapidly consuming the Pacific Northwest's resources. When President William McKinley signed the bill, it marked a recognition that the glaciers and forests of the Pacific Northwest were national treasures of the same caliber as the geysers of Wyoming or the granite cliffs of Yosemite. However, the park is not a static museum piece. It is a landscape in flux. Today, Mount Rainier National Park is a focal point for scientific research concerning climate change. The glaciers of Rainier are retreating. While there are fluctuations year to year based on snowfall, the long-term trend is undeniable. As temperatures rise, the ablation zone, the area where ice melts, moves higher up the mountain. This retreat impacts the stream flow in late summer. Since the glaciers act as frozen reservoirs that release water during the hottest, driest months, their shrinkage threatens the water supply for the ecosystems and human communities downstream. The changing climate also affects the delicate timing of the wildflower bloom. If the snow melts too early, the flowers may bloom before their pollinators, the hummingbirds and bees, have arrived or hatched. This phenological mismatch can lead to reproductive failure for the plants and starvation for the insects. Furthermore, the geological hazard remains ever present. Mount Rainier is considered one of the most dangerous volcanoes in the world, not because its eruption is imminent today, but because of the sheer volume of ice it holds and the density of the population living in the valleys below. The United States Geological Survey maintains a robust monitoring network of seismometers and GPS stations on the mountain to detect the subtle ground swelling or swarms of earthquakes that would signal the movement of magma. The study of the park's geology is not just academic, it is a matter of public safety. The rotten rock theory is a critical component of this science. Because the volcano has been hydrothermally active for so long, acidic steam and hot water have percolated through the upper cone, turning hard andesite lava into soft clay. This internal weakness means that a massive landslide or lahar could theoretically occur even without a volcanic eruption, triggered perhaps by a large earthquake or simple gravity acting on an unstable slope. This hydrothermal alteration is visible in the sunset colors of the rocks on the ridges, yellows, reds, and oranges, indicating the chemical breakdown of the minerals. The water systems of the park, originating from these glaciers and snowfields, are the arteries of the landscape. The White River, flowing northeast, is a classic braided river system. Because the source is a glacier, the river carries a massive load of sediment. As the river reaches flatter ground, the water slows down and drops the heavy rocks and sand. This accumulation forces the river to split into multiple channels that weave back and forth, creating a wide, unstable riverbed that changes with every flood. The Carbon River, in the northwest corner, is prone to such extreme flooding that it frequently washes out the road leading into the park, leading to a management decision to convert the road into a trail, retreating from the unyielding force of the river. This dynamic hydrology creates unique habitats. The shifting gravel bars of the rivers are nesting grounds for shorebirds and colonizing plants that specialize in disturbed soil. The ecological balance of Mount Rainier is also a story of the night. Bats play a crucial but often overlooked role in the park's food web. Several species, including the little brown bat and the hoary bat, patrol the night skies, consuming tons of insects. Their presence is vital for controlling moth and mosquito populations. The park's darkness is also a resource. Far from the light pollution of the major cities, the night sky at Rainier offers a pristine view of the cosmos, connecting the geological time of the mountain to the cosmic time of the universe. The old-growth forests of the lower slopes are structured in layers. The canopy, reaching over 200 feet high, modifies the wind and temperature. Below that is the subcanopy, occupied by shade-tolerant trees like the western hemlock. Then comes the shrub layer, with vine maple and devil's club, a plant with massive spiny leaves that looks prehistoric. Finally, the forest floor is covered in a carpet of mosses and oxalis. This multi-layered structure provides niches for a multitude of species. The flying squirrel glides between the trees in the darkness, feeding on truffles, the fruiting bodies of underground fungi. The red tree vole spends almost its entire life in the canopy of Douglas firs, eating the needles and obtaining water from the dew that collects on them. These specialized lives are only possible because of the stability and age of the forest. It takes centuries to develop the structural complexity of an old-growth ecosystem. The transition from forest to meadow at the tree line is not a sharp line but a jagged battlefront. This ecotone is shifting. As the climate warms, trees are beginning to colonize the subalpine meadows. Young firs and hemlocks are sprouting in the fields of wildflowers. While this might seem like a simple expansion of the forest, it represents a loss of the meadow habitat. The meadows are smaller and more fragmented than the continuous forest, making them more vulnerable. Park scientists monitor this encroachment carefully, understanding that the loss of the meadows would mean the loss of the specific biodiversity that relies on them. In the highest reaches, the Arctic island of the summit cone presents a formidable environment. Here, there are steam vents and fumaroles, particularly in the two summit craters. These vents melt caves into the ice cap, creating a labyrinth of steam tunnels beneath the glaciers. In these dark, warm, humid caves, life exists in the form of extremophile bacteria and algae, thriving in conditions that resemble the early Earth or perhaps other planets. These summit caves are a stark contrast to the frozen, wind-blasted surface just a few feet above. The summit itself is often shrouded in a lenticular cloud, a lens-shaped cap cloud that forms when moist air flows over the peak. This cloud can form rapidly, trapping climbers in zero visibility conditions, a reminder of the mountain's ability to generate its own hazardous weather. The nutrient cycling in the park is heavily influenced by the salmon. Although the high waterfalls prevent salmon from reaching the upper tributaries within the park, the rivers flowing out of the park are salmon strongholds. The nutrients brought from the ocean by the salmon are transferred to the terrestrial ecosystem by bears and eagles that feed on the fish and drag the carcasses into the forest. Even at the higher elevations, the ecosystem is not closed. Nutrients arrive via the wind, Dust from Asian deserts and pollen from distant forests are deposited on the snow, providing the trace minerals needed for the lichens and alpine plants to grow on the barren rock. The park's boundaries also encompass a range of cultural history sites, from the mining claims of the late 19th century to the rustic architecture of the National Park Service's early years. The Paradise Inn and the administration buildings are built in the National Park rustic style, using native stone and massive timbers to make the structures blend into the landscape. This architectural philosophy reflects the early 20th century ideal of harmonizing human presence with nature, a visual representation of the park's mission to conserve the scenery. Understanding Mount Rainier requires looking at the interconnectedness of these systems. The glaciers shape the valleys. The valleys channel the wind. The wind dictates the precipitation. The precipitation determines the vegetation. The vegetation supports the wildlife, and the wildlife influences the vegetation. It is a seamless web. For example, the huckleberry patches rely on the bees for pollination, but they also rely on the fire history. Many of the huckleberry fields in the park were maintained by indigenous burning practices for thousands of years to prevent the forest from encroaching. Without fire, the forest eventually overtakes the berry bushes. Today, the suppression of natural fires has altered this balance, leading to a decline in huckleberry production and a change in the food availability for bears. The geological story continues with the concept of inverted topography. Some of the ridges radiating from the mountain, like Mazama Ridge, are actually ancient lava flows that filled valleys. Over time, the softer rock of the surrounding ridges eroded away, leaving the harder lava flow standing high as a ridge. This inversion is a testament to the immense time spans and erosion rates at play. The rock we stand on today at sunrise was once a valley floor. The biological distinctiveness of the park is further highlighted by the presence of endemic species, organisms found nowhere else. While Mount Rainier shares many species with the rest of the Cascades, its isolation and size have created unique genetic pockets. The Rainier variety of the Olympic salamander and specific subspecies of alpine plants are evolved to the specific microclimates of this volcanic island. This isolation also means that if these species are pushed to extinction on the mountain, they are lost forever. The hydrology of the park includes not just surface water but complex groundwater systems. The volcanic rock is porous and fractured. Meltwater infiltrates deep into the mountain, where it is heated by the magmatic core and rises as mineral springs. The Longmire area is famous for these springs, which were the initial draw for early tourism. These mineral waters create wetlands that are distinct chemically from the snowmelt wetlands, supporting different communities of algae and insects. In the realm of plant physiology, the adaptations to the heavy snowpack are fascinating. The subalpine fir has a narrow, spire-like shape that sheds snow easily, preventing its branches from breaking under the weight. The flexible branches of the Sitka alder and vine maple are adapted to be pressed flat against the ground by the snow, only to spring back up when the melt occurs. This elasticity allows them to survive in avalanche chutes, where rigid trees would be snapped like matchsticks. These avalanche chutes appear as vertical stripes of bright green deciduous brush cutting through the dark evergreen forest, creating vertical corridors that are favored by deer and bears. The soundscape of the park is also a natural feature. The roar of the rivers is constant in the valleys. In the forests, the call of the winter wren, a tiny bird with a disproportionately loud and complex song, pierces the silence. In the high alpine, the wind is the dominant sound, often howling at hurricane force. The silence of the winter snowpack is profound, dampening sound waves and creating a sense of isolation that is a key part of the wilderness character the park preserves. Mount Rainier National Park serves as a barometer for the health of the North American environment. Its glaciers measure the temperature, its amphibians test the water quality, its lichens analyze the air purity. It is a rugged, dangerous, and beautiful landscape that demands respect. It is a place where the forces of creation and destruction are visible on a massive scale, playing out in slow motion through geology and in fast forward through the seasons. The mountain stands as a sentinel, a water tower, and a refuge, comprising a world of ice, rock, forest, and meadow that functions as a single, breathing entity. While the geological and biological descriptions paint a picture of a wilderness functioning in isolation, the reality of Mount Rainier is that it has been a focal point of human interaction for nearly 10,000 years. The notion of the park as a pristine, untouched wilderness is a relatively modern construct that overlooks the deep ancestral connections of the indigenous peoples to this landscape. Long before the arrival of European explorers or the drawing of park boundaries, the mountain served as a vital center of gravity for the interplay of culture, economy, and spirituality among the tribes of the Pacific Northwest. To fully understand the identity of the park, one must look past the ice and rock to the archaeological record and the living traditions of the Nisqually, Puyallup, Squaxin Island, Muckleshoot, Yakima, and Cowlitz peoples. Recent archaeological investigations within the park have radically shifted the scientific understanding of prehistoric human use of the mountain. For decades, it was assumed that the high elevations were largely avoided due to the harsh conditions and spiritual potency of the peak. However, rigorous field studies, particularly in the subalpine archaeological zones like Sunrise and Chinook Pass, have unearthed a different story. Researchers have discovered lithic scatters, remnants of stone toolmaking, dating back between 4,000 and 9,000 years. These artifacts, primarily projectile points and scrapers made from chert, jasper, and obsidian, indicate that the subalpine meadows were not merely visited but were seasonally inhabited by hunting parties. The chemical signature of the obsidian found at these sites is particularly telling. It does not originate from the mountain itself, but matches sources in Oregon and eastern Washington. This evidence suggests that Mount Rainier was a nexus of trade and travel, a high-elevation crossroads where people from the coastal lowlands met with people from the interior plateau to exchange resources, genes, and ideas. The primary driver for this seasonal ascent into the high country was likely the pursuit of specific resources that were unavailable in the dense lowland forests. The subalpine meadows offered a bounty of plant and animal life during the short summer window. The huckleberry harvest was, and remains, a cultural keystone. The slopes of Mount Rainier produce distinct varieties of vaccinium, particularly the thin-leaved huckleberry, which is prized for its flavor and drying properties. Indigenous families would migrate to the high meadows in late summer, establishing camps to harvest and process immense quantities of berries. These berries were dried over slow fires to preserve them for the long, dark winter months, providing a critical source of vitamin C and carbohydrates. This harvest was not a passive activity. It was actively managed. Oral histories and paleoecological records suggest that for thousands of years, native peoples used controlled fire to maintain the openness of the meadows. By burning the encroaching saplings and brush, they ensured the huckleberry patches remained productive and prevented the forest from swallowing the subalpine gardens. Thus, the iconic meadows that modern visitors admire for their wildflowers are, in part, a legacy of millennia of indigenous horticultural management. Beyond the berries, the high country offered mountain goats. The wool of the mountain goat was a resource of immense value. woven into blankets and regalia that held high prestige in the potlatch culture of the Salish Sea peoples. Hunting these animals in the treacherous terrain of the glacial margins required exceptional skill and knowledge of the landscape. The discovery of rock shelters and hunting blinds near the snowline speaks to the durability and adaptability of these early inhabitants. These people possessed a sophisticated understanding of the mountain's meteorology and biology, timing their movements to coincide with the melting snow and the ripening fruit, retreating only when the autumn storms began to reclaim the peaks. This seasonal rhythm is dictated by the specific climatic mechanics of the region, which are worth examining in detail. The climate of Mount Rainier National Park is classified generally as a Mediterranean-type climate with a cool, maritime influence, but this label belies the complexity of the atmospheric forces at work. The mountain exists at the intersection of two major atmospheric pressure systems, the Aleutian Low and the North Pacific High. In the winter, the Aleutian Low dominates. This semi-permanent low-pressure system in the Gulf of Alaska acts as a conveyor belt, sending a relentless series of cyclonic storms slamming into the Pacific Northwest coast. Because Mount Rainier stands as a solitary obstacle in the path of this flow, it extracts moisture with ruthless efficiency. The physics of this process involves adiabatic cooling. As the moist air is forced up the mountain's flanks, it expands and cools. Cold air holds less water vapor than warm air, so the excess moisture is jettisoned as snow. This is why the snow line is so sharply defined, and why the accumulation is so massive. In contrast, the summer months are governed by the North Pacific High, a high-pressure system that moves northward, blocking the storm track and creating a season of drought. This duality, extreme winter precipitation followed by significant summer dryness, creates a high-stress environment for the flora. The plants must be adapted to survive, being crushed by snow for 9 months, and then parched by drought for 3. This climatic oscillation is intensified by the phenomenon of thermal belts and inversions. On clear, calm nights, the ground loses heat rapidly to space. The air in contact with the ground cools and becomes dense, sliding down the slopes like water and pooling in the valley bottoms. Consequently, the valley floors can be significantly colder than the ridges above them. This cold air drainage creates frost pockets where trees cannot survive, helping to maintain the open grassy valleys like Grand Park, a large, flat plateau that remains surprisingly treeless despite being well below the timberline. The seasonal transition on the mountain is a rapid, violent shift rather than a gentle fade. Spring is known as the, quote, melt-out, a period where the hydrology of the park goes into overdrive. As the sun angle increases and the days lengthen, the solar radiation striking the snowpack initiates metamorphosis in the snow crystals. The snow densifies, turning from fluffy powder into coarse, granular corn snow. Water begins to percolate through the snowpack, lubricating the base and increasing the risk of wet slab avalanches. This is a critical time for the river systems. The hydrographs of the Nisqually and White Rivers show massive spikes in discharge, not from rain, but from the sudden release of water stored in the winter snowpack. This meltwater is distinct from glacial melt. It is clear, cold, and carries a different chemical signature than the sediment-laden water that will flow later in the summer when the glacial ice itself begins to melt. Within the aquatic ecosystems, this shift from snowmelt to glacial melt triggers a changing of the guard among the macroinvertebrates. In the early season, when the water is clear and cold, the streams are dominated by species of stoneflies and mayflies that require pristine, sediment-free water to breathe. Their gills are delicate and easily clogged by silt. As the summer progresses and the snow disappears, the rivers switch to being fed by the glaciers. The water turns turbid with glacial flour, the temperature drops slightly near the source, and the flow becomes more erratic, pulsing with the daily rhythm of the sun hitting the ice. In these conditions, a different set of insects takes over, specifically adapted chironomids, midges, and caddisflies that can tolerate the scouring action of the silt and the lower visibility. This temporal partitioning allows a greater diversity of life to exist in the same river channel, separated by time rather than space. One of the most peculiar and scientifically fascinating inhabitants of the park's cryosphere, the world of ice, is the ice worm, Mesenchytreus solifugus. These are not microscopic organisms, but visible, thread-like annelid worms, roughly an inch long and black in color. They are the only known annelid worms that complete their entire life cycle in glacial ice. During the day, they burrow deep into the microfissures of the glacier to avoid the intense ultraviolet radiation of the sun. At night, they migrate to the surface to feed on algae, pollen, and bacteria that have been deposited on the ice by the wind. Their physiology is a miracle of biochemical adaptation. Their cellular enzymes are tuned to function at 0 degrees Celsius. If an ice worm is held in a human hand, the heat of the palm is enough to cause its enzymes to denature, essentially melting the worm from the inside out. They are obligate psychrophiles, organisms that love the cold and die if exposed to warmth, making them potentially one of the most climate-sensitive species in the park. Moving from the ice to the deep forests, the complexity of the ecosystem is driven by the decay of wood. In the Pacific Northwest rainforest, death is as important as life. A defining feature of the old-growth forests in the Carbon and Ohanapeke valleys is the abundance of coarse woody debris, scientific shorthand for the massive fallen logs that litter the forest floor. These logs are not waste, they are biological batteries. A large Douglas fir log can take centuries to decompose. As it does, it acts as a sponge, absorbing water during the winter rains and releasing it slowly during the summer drought. By late summer, when the soil is dry, the interior of a nurse log may still contain significant moisture, providing a lifeline for the roots of young hemlocks and huckleberries growing upon it. Furthermore, these rotting logs are the primary site of nitrogen fixation in the forest. Specific bacteria living in the decaying wood pull nitrogen from the air and convert it into a form that plants can use, a crucial process in these nutrient-poor volcanic soils. The forest floor is also home to a group of plants that have abandoned photosynthesis entirely. These are the mycoheterotrophs, such as the ghost plant, Monotropa uniflora, and the pine sap. Because the canopy is so dense, light on the forest floor is scarce. These plants have evolved to bypass the need for sun. They lack chlorophyll and appear waxy white or bright red. Instead of making their own food, they tap into the mycorrhizal fungal network that connects the trees. They are essentially parasites on the fungi, which are in turn symbiotic with the trees. So the ghost plant gets its sugar from a Douglas fir tree nearby, with the fungus acting as the bridge. This reveals a level of interconnectivity, where a small, pale flower on the ground is chemically tethered to the giant conifers towering hundreds of feet above. Ascending back to the subalpine ecotone, the interaction between flora and fauna becomes a study in coevolution. The wildflowers of the subalpine meadows have evolved specific shapes and colors to attract specific pollinators. The red tubular flowers of the paintbrush are designed for the beak of the rufous hummingbird. These birds perform an incredible migration, traveling from Mexico to the slopes of Rainier to breed. They are aggressive defenders of their flower patches, engaging in aerial dogfights to protect their nectar sources. The blue and purple flowers, like the lupines and monkshood, are generally adapted for bumblebees. Rainier is home to several species of high-elevation bumblebees, which have evolved thicker pile hair to insulate them against the cold mountain air. Unlike honeybees, bumblebees can thermoregulate. They can disconnect their flight muscles from their wings and vibrate them to generate heat, allowing them to fly in temperatures that would ground other insects. This ability is critical in the unpredictable weather of the subalpine summer. The subalpine zone is also the setting for a slow-motion geological disaster, the encroachment of the forests. Visitors to the park often notice distinct stands of dead, silvery snags standing in the meadows or along the edges of lakes. These are often the result of changing water tables or volcanic activity, but in some areas, they represent the dynamic nature of the tree line. However, a more subtle change is the meadow invasion. As the climate warms, the snowpack melts earlier. The tree seedlings, subalpine fir and mountain hemlock, that would normally be crushed by the snow or killed by a short growing season, are now surviving. They are establishing themselves in the wildflower meadows. While trees are generally seen as positive, in this context, they represent a loss of biodiversity. The meadow ecosystem is shrinking as the forest ecosystem expands upward. Park scientists are studying this actively, trying to determine if this is a natural cycle or an accelerated anthropogenic shift. The geology of the park offers further intrigue when one examines the hydrothermal system in detail. The steam that rises from the summit craters is not just water vapor. It contains carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, and helium. The ratio of these gases is monitored closely because a change in the ratio can indicate fresh magma moving into the system deep underground. This hydrothermal activity has also altered the rock of the mountain itself. In many places, such as the Sunset Amphitheater, the rock is not the hard gray andesite one expects, but a soft, crumbling clay in vivid shades of yellow and orange. This is the result of acid alteration. Sulfuric acid from the volcanic gases dissolves the minerals in the rock, leaving behind weak clay and silica. This rotten rock is significant because it is structurally unstable. It is this altered rock that poses the greatest landslide risk. The electron mud flow that devastated the landscape 500 years ago originated from a collapse of this weakened material. Thus, the beauty of the colorful rocks is directly linked to the danger they represent. The park's atmosphere also plays a role in a global transport system. The permanent snowfields of Mount Rainier act as a chemical archive. Particles from the atmosphere settle on the snow and are trapped as it turns to ice. Researchers analyzing core samples from the glaciers have found dust from the Gobi Desert in Asia, evidence of forest fires from Siberia, and industrial pollutants from across the Pacific. The mountain is a net that catches the world's wind-borne drift. This creates a paradox where this pristine environment contains traces of the entire industrialized world. It also means that the nutrients carried by this dust, phosphorus and iron, are depositing on the high alpine ridges, potentially influencing which lichens and plants can survive in the most barren zones. In the highest alpine reaches, life relies on the cushion plant strategy. Plants like the moss campion grow in tight, dense mounds. This shape is aerodynamic, allowing the fierce winds to flow over them without stripping away moisture or leaves. The interior of the cushion creates a microclimate. Measurements have shown that the temperature inside a moss campion clump can be 20 degrees warmer than the surrounding air. This warmth allows the plant to carry out photosynthesis and cellular respiration even when the ambient temperature is near freezing. These plants are incredibly slow-growing. A cushion plant the size of a dinner plate might be 50 to 100 years old. A careless footstep by a climber can destroy a century of growth in a second, highlighting the fragility of this resilient-looking ecosystem. The soundscape of the park changes dramatically with the seasons and elevation, but one specific acoustic phenomenon is the thunder of the glaciers. In the heat of the summer, the glaciers are active. As they move, they crack and calve. Huge blocks of ice break off at the terminus, or deep crevasses open up with a resonant boom. In the amphitheaters like Willis Wall on the north side, the sound of rockfall is almost continuous. This is the sound of the mountain tearing itself down. The Carbon Glacier, walled in by steep cliffs, is a natural echo chamber where these sounds are amplified. For the quiet observer, the mountain is rarely silent. It groans, cracks, and rushes with the sound of moving water and ice. Deep within the forest, the interaction between the varied thrush and the understory is another thread in the ecological web. The varied thrush is a bird of the wet, dark forest. Its eerie metallic whistle is the soundtrack of the Pacific Northwest rainforest. It feeds largely on invertebrates in the leaf litter during the summer, but in the winter it switches to fruit and acorns. It is a key disperser of seeds for the understory plants. Its presence is an indicator of forest health. It requires large, uninterrupted tracts of mature forest. Fragmentation of the forest by roads or logging outside the park boundaries impacts these birds, which in turn affects the seed dispersal within the park. This demonstrates that the park's biological integrity is dependent on the health of the surrounding landscape. Even the soil of Mount Rainier is distinct. It is an andesol, a soil order formed on volcanic ash. These soils are lightweight, fluffy, and have a high capacity to hold water and phosphate. However, they are also easily eroded. When a hiker steps off the trail in a meadow, they compress this ash soil. The air pockets are squeezed out, the water holding capacity is lost, and the soil turns to concrete. The plants die, and the heavy rains wash the soil away, leaving a scar that can take decades to heal. This is why the meadow stomping of the early 20th century caused damage that is still being restored today. The park's restoration crews use a technique called scarification to break up this compacted soil and replant native seeds collected from the immediate area to preserve the genetic integrity of the local flora. The cultural history extends to the era of the climbing rock. The guide service on Mount Rainier is one of the oldest in the country. The legacy of the Whitaker twins, Lou and Jim, is woven into the history of the park. They, along with other legendary guides, developed techniques on the glaciers of Rainier that were later used to conquer the highest peaks in the Himalayas. The mountain served as the proving ground for American mountaineering. Equipment like the specialized crampons and ice axes and clothing layering systems were tested and refined in the brutal storms of Rainier. The Camp Muir High Camp, sitting at 10,000 feet, is not just a collection of stone shelters. It is a historic site where the culture of American alpinism was forged. Furthermore, the park encompasses the story of the Japanese-American community. Before World War II, many Japanese Americans were employed in the logging industries around the mountain and visited the park frequently. The Picnic Rock area near the Nisqually entrance holds historical significance for these communities. The internment of Japanese Americans during the war severed this connection abruptly, a cultural silence that is only now being recognized and memorialized in the interpretive programs of the park. As we look at the hydrologic output, the Ohanapikosh Hot Springs represented different geological plumbing. Unlike the steam vents at the summit, these springs are fed by water that has circulated deep into the crust, heated by the cooling magma miles below, and returned to the surface laden with dissolved minerals. In the early days of the park, these were developed as health spas, with bathhouses and hotels. Today, the buildings are gone, removed to allow the natural system to recover, but the hot springs remain, bubbling into the river, creating microhabitats for thermophilic algae and adding a sulfurous scent to the deep woods, a reminder of the volcanic heat simmering beneath the lush veneer of the forest. The complexity of Mount Rainier National Park is fractal. The closer you look, the more detail emerges. It is found in the way the lichens dissolve the rock to create the first grains of soil, in the way the elk herds memorize the migration routes over generations, in the way the glaciers breathe, expanding and contracting with the climate. It is a landscape that demands us to think in multiple timescales simultaneously: the instant flash of a lightning strike, the seasonal pulse of the snowpack, the millennial growth of the old-growth cedar, and the geologic epoch of the volcano's life. To comprehend the full magnitude of Mount Rainier, one must look beyond the immediate biological pulse of the forest and the seasonal rhythms of the wildlife, and instead turn toward the deep, slow-moving clock of geology. The living skin of the park, the trees, the animals, the meadows, is merely a thin veneer draped over a skeletal structure forged in the violence of the Earth's interior. The story of the landscape formation here is not a single chapter but a saga of destruction and reconstruction, a cycle where mountains are born from fire, ground down by ice, and rebuilt again. To stand on the slopes of Rainier is to stand on a battlefield where the tectonic forces of the planet are locked in an eternal struggle with the erosive forces of the atmosphere. The geological history of Mount Rainier National Park begins long before the current volcano existed. If one were to travel back in time 40 million years to the Eocene epoch, the towering white mountain would be absent. Instead, the region was a low-lying coastal plain, a swampy environment similar to the modern Mississippi Delta, bordering a shallow sea. The climate was subtropical, hot, and humid. The evidence of this ancient world is locked in the rock formations known as the Puget Group. These sedimentary rocks, found deep beneath the western edges of the foothills, contain coal seams formed from the compressed vegetation of those ancient swamps. Over millions of years, as the North American plate continued its westward drift and the oceanic plates subducted beneath it, this landscape was compressed, folded, and uplifted. The true foundation of the park, the pedestal upon which Mount Rainier sits, consists of the Tatoosh Range. Visitors looking south from the Paradise area see these jagged, dark peaks: Pinnacle Peak, Unicorn Peak, and the Castle. These mountains are not volcanic cones like Rainier. They are the remains of a granodiorite batholith. Approximately 26 million years ago, a massive chamber of magma rose from the mantle, but failed to breach the surface. It pooled underground, miles beneath the crust, and slowly cooled over thousands of years. This slow cooling allowed large crystals to form, creating the speckled granite-like rock known as granodiorite. Over the subsequent millions of years, the overlying rock was eroded away by wind and water, exposing this hardened magma chamber. Thus, the Tatoosh Range represents the solidified heart of an ancient volcanic system that never erupted, now laid bare by the relentless carving of the elements. It is upon this eroded, plutonic surface that the modern volcano eventually began to build itself. The birth of the modern Mount Rainier is a relatively recent event in geological terms, beginning approximately 500,000 years ago. It is part of the Cascade Volcanic Arc, which is directly fueled by the Cascadia subduction zone. As the Juan de Fuca plate dives beneath the North American plate, it carries water-laden sediments into the hot mantle. The water lowers the melting point of the rock, creating blobs of magma that rise like the wax in a lava lamp. Mount Rainier represents one of the primary vents for this rising magma. The early history of the mountain involved the eruption of thick, viscous lava flows that piled up around the vent. Unlike the fluid basalt of Hawaii, which flows in fast rivers, the andesite and dacite lavas of Rainier are thick and sluggish, moving more like toothpaste. This high silica content makes the lava sticky, causing it to build steep flanks rather than broad shields. Throughout its 500,000-year history, the mountain has not been a static cone. It has grown and collapsed repeatedly. One of the most fascinating aspects of the park's geology is the evidence of inverted topography. In the early stages of the volcano's life, lava flows would naturally follow the path of least resistance, flowing down into the deep river valleys carved into the older Tatoosh rocks. These lava flows would fill the valleys, cooling into hard, resistant rock. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the softer surrounding rock of the ridges eroded away, while the hard lava that filled the valley bottoms remained. This process inverted the landscape. What was once a valley floor is now a high ridge. Rampart Ridge near Longmire and Mazama Ridge near Paradise are prime examples of these ancient lava flows that have outlasted the mountains that once contained them. The internal structure of the volcano is a chaotic layering of lava flows, ash deposits, and volcanic breccia, rubble created by explosive eruptions. This structure classifies Rainier as a stratovolcano. However, the integrity of this structure is compromised by the very heat that created it. For hundreds of thousands of years, acidic steam and hot water have percolated through the upper cone. This process, known as hydrothermal alteration, attacks the chemical bonds of the minerals in the rock. The hard, interlocking crystals of plagioclase feldspar are chemically converted into soft, clay minerals like kaolinite and smectite. This turns the solid rock into a material with the structural integrity of wet cardboard. This rotten rock is visible in the Sunset Amphitheater and the scars on the west face of the mountain. It is this internal weakness that makes Mount Rainier so prone to landslides and lahars, even without a volcanic eruption to trigger them. The most cataclysmic event in the mountain's recent geological history occurred roughly 5,600 years ago. This was the Osceola mudflow. Before this event, the summit of Mount Rainier was likely much higher than it is today, perhaps reaching 16,000 feet, a symmetrical cone resembling Mount Fuji. During a period of eruptive activity, the weakened, hydrothermally altered summit collapsed. Whether triggered by a steam explosion, an earthquake, or the injection of fresh magma, the result was the same. A massive sector of the mountain slid away. This was not a dry landslide. It incorporated the massive volume of water stored in the summit glaciers. The mixture of rock, clay, ice, and water transformed into a lahar of unimaginable scale. The Osceola mudflow poured down the White River Valley at speeds exceeding 40 miles per hour. It was a wall of mud hundreds of feet high. It did not stop at the park boundaries. It flowed all the way to the Puget Sound, covering over 200 square miles. The towns of Enumclaw and Buckley are built directly on top of this ancient mudflow deposit. This event decapitated the mountain, leaving a massive crater that was roughly a mile wide. The summit we see today, Columbia Crest, is actually a small, younger cone that has grown inside that ancient collapse crater over the last few thousand years. The shaping of the landscape is also the story of ice. While the fire builds the mountain, the ice takes it apart. Mount Rainier is the most heavily glaciated peak in the contiguous United States, and these glaciers are not passive blankets of snow. They are active excavators. The mechanism of glacial erosion is twofold: abrasion and plucking. As the heavy ice slides downhill, rocks frozen into the bottom of the glacier act like diamond tips on a drill, grinding the bedrock smooth and creating striations, scratches that indicate the direction of flow. This grinding produces glacial flour, the fine silt that clouds the rivers. Plucking occurs when the glacier freezes to loose rocks on the bedrock surface and rips them away as it moves. This process is responsible for the steep, amphitheater-like basins known as cirques. When three or more cirques erode back into a single peak, they form a sharp, pyramidal horn. Little Tahoma Peak, the jagged spire on the east flank of the mountain, is a remnant of the volcano's earlier, broader flank that has been whittled away by the surrounding glaciers, leaving a sharp volcanic neck standing in isolation. The glaciers also create distinctive depositional features. As they transport the rock they have ripped from the mountain, they deposit it in ridges called moraines. Lateral moraines form along the sides of the glacier, leaving long, sharp ridges of debris when the ice recedes. Terminal moraines mark the furthest advance of the ice, creating dams that can form lakes. The landscape of the park is littered with these glacial signatures. The Wonderland Trail, which encircles the mountain, forces hikers to climb up and down these steep ridges of loose rock, a testament to the immense volume of material the glaciers have moved over millennia. The interaction between the volcanism and the glaciation creates unique rock formations. One such formation is columnar jointing, visible in places like the andesite columns near Kraken's Point. When a thick lava flow comes to rest, it begins to cool and contract. If the cooling is uniform, the tension fractures the rock into hexagonal columns, creating a geometric pattern that looks like a honeycomb or a pipe organ. At Rainier, these lava flows often interacted with ice. If lava erupts under a glacier, it cools rapidly and shatters, forming glassy, fragmented ridges. The ridge known as the berm in the Sunrise area serves as a geological puzzle. It is an arrangement of rocks that suggests interaction between hot lava and thick ice, a reminder that the glaciers of the past were far larger and thicker than those we see today. The geological distinctiveness of Mount Rainier is also recorded in the tephra layers found in the soil. Tephra is the collective term for volcanic material blasted into the air. By digging into the soil in the subalpine meadows, geologists can read the history of the entire Cascade Range. They find layers of ash not just from Rainier, but from other volcanoes. There is a distinctive layer of yellow-orange pumice known as Layer Y, which came from Mount St. Helens about 3,500 years ago. There's the unmistakable Layer O, the Mazama ash, deposited when Mount Mazama exploded and collapsed to form Crater Lake in Oregon, roughly 7,700 years ago. This ash covered the entire Pacific Northwest. These layers serve as time markers, allowing scientists to date the archaeological sites and the glacial moraines relative to these known eruptions. The landscape is also shaped by the water that flows beneath the surface. The volcanic edifice is porous. Snowmelt seeps into the fractures and faults, descending deep into the crust where it is heated by the magmatic system. This heated water becomes buoyant and rises back to the surface, carrying dissolved minerals. This is the origin of the mineral springs at Longmire and Ohanapakash. These travertine deposits, mounds of calcium carbonate precipitated from the water, are geological formations in real time. The water at Ohanapakash is rich in sodium and chloride, suggesting it may be interacting with ancient marine sedimentary rocks deep beneath the volcano, linking the modern water cycle to the ancient Eocene oceans. The hazard posed by Mount Rainier is the dark side of its geological majesty. It is often cited as the most dangerous volcano in the United States, due to the proximity of the population in the Seattle-Tacoma metropolitan area. The danger is not necessarily a fiery explosion like Pompeii, but the wet, flowing destruction of lahars. The electron mudflow, which occurred around 500 years ago, was a non-magmatic event. A section of the Sunset Amphitheater collapsed, sending a mudflow down the Puyallup River Valley. It buried the forest at the base of the mountain, preserving the stumps of old-growth trees which can still be seen today. This event proved that the mountain does not need to erupt to be deadly. Gravity and hydrothermal weakening are enough. To monitor this, the United States Geological Survey has instrumented the mountain with a sophisticated array of sensors. Seismometers listen for the harmonic tremors that indicate moving magma. GPS stations measure the deformation of the ground, detecting if the mountain is inflating like a balloon. Acoustic flow monitors are positioned in the river valleys to detect the ground-shaking frequency of a lahar rushing downstream, designed to give the towns below precious minutes of warning. The future of the park's landscape is a subject of intense predictive modeling. Climate change is altering the geological processes. As the glaciers retreat, they leave behind steep, unsupported walls of loose rock. These over-steepened slopes are prone to rockfall. The increased heat also warms the high-altitude permafrost that acts as a glue holding some of the ridges together. As this ice melts, the rock becomes unstable. We are seeing an increase in debris flows, smaller, localized landslides that wash out trails and roads. The connection between the atmosphere and the geosphere is direct. A warmer atmosphere leads to a more physically unstable mountain. Furthermore, the retreat of the glaciers exposes new land. This primary succession, where life colonizes bare rock, is a geological process as much as a biological one. The roots of the first plants secrete acids that break down the rock, beginning the slow conversion of the volcano into soil. The valleys of the park, such as the Stevens Canyon, reveal the power of water to cut through rock. The bedrock here displays the layering of the Stevens Ridge Formation, a massive deposit of welded ashflow tuff. This rock was formed from a pyroclastic flow, a superheated avalanche of gas and ash that fused together instantly upon stopping. The river has since cut a gorge through this hard rock, creating waterfalls like Martha Falls and Narada Falls. Waterfalls are often geologically temporary features. They form where a stream flows over a layer of hard rock onto softer rock, undercutting the ledge. Over time, the waterfall recedes upstream. The position of Narada Falls today is just a snapshot in its migration up the Paradise River. The geological narrative also encompasses the concept of the Rainier seismic zone. The mountain sits somewhat west of the main axis of the Cascade Range. It is situated along a zone of crustal weakness where the tectonic stress of the North American plate is being released. Earthquakes are common in the park, though most are too small to be felt. These micro-earthquakes are the creaking of the crust as it adjusts to the stresses of the subduction zone and the weight of the mountain itself. The weight of the volcanic pile is immense, actually depressing the crust beneath it. If the glaciers were to melt completely, the crust would likely rebound slightly, a process known as isostatic rebound, though on a smaller scale than what is seen in the Arctic. Another specific geological feature of interest is the presence of andesite columns at various locations, such as near the Pearl Falls. These formed when lava pooled in deep canyons and cooled very slowly. The fracturing creates perfect hexagonal pillars that can be dozens of feet high. These are often hidden in the remote corners of the park, accessible only to those willing to traverse off-trail, guarding the secrets of the mountain's eruptive past. The interplay of fire and ice is also evident in the ridge-capping flows. Often, a lava flow would run down a valley carved by a glacier. Later, after the lava hardened, a new glaciation would occur, but the hard lava would resist erosion better than the surrounding rock. This leads to the ridges we see today, which are essentially fossilized lava rivers standing in relief. The hydrologic geology extends to the glacial outburst floods. Occasionally, a glacier will advance and block a side stream, creating a temporary lake. When the ice dam breaks or the water floats the ice, the lake drains catastrophically. These jackalapes scour the riverbeds, moving massive boulders that regular floods could never budge. The boulder fields in the lower Kotz Creek Valley are the result of such a flood that occurred in 1947, triggered by heavy rains melting the glacier. The water turned into a slurry of rock and mud that wiped out the road and changed the forest succession forever. Even the color of the rivers is a geological signal. The White River is white because of the suspended silica. The Ohana Pekosh is clear because it drains a lake that acts as a settling basin. The Carbon River is dark and gray. These colors tell the story of what is happening upstream, how much ice is grinding, what type of rock is being eroded, and how fast the water is moving. The braided nature of the White River near the park entrance is a direct result of the sediment load exceeding the river's carrying capacity, forcing it to drop its burden and constantly change its path. This dynamic landscape creates a headache for engineers, but a paradise for geologists studying fluvial processes. To look at the rock of Mount Rainier is to see a history of violence and tranquility. The breccias speak of explosive eruptions that threw rock miles into the air. The pumice layers speak of ash clouds that blackened the sky. The finely layered lava flows speak of quiet effusions of molten rock. And the granite of the Tatoosh speaks of the deep, slow cooling in the womb of the earth. Every pebble in the riverbed has a genealogy that traces back to a specific flow, a specific eruption, a specific moment when the earth opened up. In the end, Mount Rainier National Park is far more than a recreational playground or a scenic backdrop for the cities of the Pacific Northwest. It is a cathedral of the natural world, a place where the fundamental forces of our planet are on grand display. It serves as a reminder of our scale in the universe. We stand on the flank of a volcano that has built itself up and torn itself down over 500,000 years, a beast that sleeps but never truly dies. The glaciers that cloak it are the remnants of the ice ages, sensitive indicators of the changing climate that we are only beginning to understand. The forests that cling to its skirts are ancient libraries of genetic wisdom, survivors of fires, floods, and storms. The park is a paradox of permanence and fragility. The mountain looks eternal, a fixed point on the horizon, yet it is dissolving before our eyes, grain by grain, in the milky rivers that flow to the sea. It is a landscape that demands humility. It teaches us that the earth is active, that the ground beneath our feet is moving, and that the quiet beauty of a wildflower meadow can exist atop the ruins of a cataclysmic landslide. To visit Mount Rainier is to witness the raw, unfinished work of creation. It is to be in the presence of a power that is indifferent to human timelines, a geological giant that breathes in centuries and sleeps in millennia. As long as the tectonic plates continue to grind beneath the ocean, and as long as the winds blow from the Pacific, Mount Rainier will remain a white beacon of ice and fire, a testament to the violent, beautiful, and ever-changing nature of the world we inhabit.